Testing. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. How y'all doing? Oh. How y'all doing? Come on. All right. A little bit better. So it's just going to be the three of us here, and we're going to do this a little bit different. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first, and then I'll let our two panelists go as well. So you've already seen the information that's obviously in my bio. I'm a commissioner on the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. I work with Vulnerable Communities Initiatives and 100 Miles and a number of different organizations. I'm not an academic. I don't write research papers. Most of my work is embedded in community. Really the reason that I'm here is exactly because of that. When we think about resiliency, disaster, all of this work, sometimes the element that gets overlooked, that should be emphasized, are the people, the communities that are in the spaces. What does it mean when we're talking about resiliency if we're not including the people and the communities? What does it mean if we're learning, but we're not really listening? So those are more of the things that I want to talk about, or that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to let our panelists just introduce themselves really quickly, and then we're just going to get right into this conversation. So we're going to start with Ms. Collins here.
Good morning. My name is Anita Collins, and I live in Brunswick, Georgia. I am a Gullah Geechee from 6th generation Gullah Geechee. Sometimes I say 5th, and then it dawns on me that there's a generation that I'm not counting, and I need to do better about that. And I live in a vulnerable community.
Good morning. I'm so excited to be here. Is that on? I'm so excited to be here. My name is Frank Alexander, and this is my first time at one of these events. I'm here as a student to learn, and I want to go ahead and begin by thanking each of you for what you were doing, what you have done, what you are planning to do. And I hope to be one of those that simply follows along and picks your brain and learns from you. So I'm so thankful for y'all. My background is, yes, I can say it here. I'm a Tar Heel born and bred, but I've lived in Georgia for the past half century. My roots are in Georgia, and I will fill in more later. But basically, you should understand that my role at this point in my life is to, as Dr. Martin said in her intro, is to listen and to learn and then to serve. And so for the past decade, I've had a chance to walk alongside of Jazz in this work in Brunswick and throughout coastal Georgia, and Ms. Collins in Brunswick. But I do it in all kinds of places. And yes, my background is as a dirt lawyer, asking too many questions.
Thank you for that introduction. So as we get started, I'm going to just say a few things that are, that we all know. Definition of disaster: sudden event, such as an accident, natural disaster, catastrophe that causes great damage or a loss of life. Resilience: process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjusting to external and internal demands. So psychological research demonstrates that resources and skills associated with resilience can be cultivated and practiced. So I'm from a place called Sapelo Island. I grew up on the coast of Georgia. To have this conversation, I have to tell you some of my story. I've known Miss Anita most of my life. We're both from the same area. Frank Alexander, I met when I was doing some work at a place that dealt with heirs property. So I kind of came into this work through social justice. I was doing community foundation work in Atlanta. On February 23rd, 2020, my younger cousin, a young man named Ahmaud Arbery, was hunted down and lynched in broad daylight. And so I ended up relocating back home and started doing social justice work and started a campaign called I Run with Maud. And in that process, all kinds of things started to be revealed. There was this article that said the home of Ahmaud Arbery has an environmental racism problem, something that we've lived with for well over 50 years. It's been there for over 100 years. So Brunswick, Georgia has about 25% of the Superfund sites right there. So we're surrounded by this contamination in our communities, in our neighborhoods. So that brought me into more environmental justice work. I reconnected, of course, with people in the community, such as Miss Anita Collins, who is the chair of an MPA that is a neighborhood that is directly impacted. At that time, I was already working with Frank Alexander with vulnerable communities, doing what I would call just devoted engagement work. Because all of this doesn't really work well if you're not truly engaging the communities. Even in the communities that I'm descended from, I listen. And I'm always still learning. And I'm talking about the people that I grew up with and I knew and have known my entire life. So I'd like to start out talking to Miss Anita first. So she is a chair of the Urbana Perry Park Neighborhood Planning Assembly. It is a neighborhood that literally sits right next to these toxic sites. And they've had all kinds of things happen with plants that are producing these toxins and things of that nature. So Ms. Anita, can you talk a little bit about, one, what has been that experience living in that space? And two, if you could touch a little bit on the disasters that have happened in Brunswick in your community.
Thank you. Hercules, later known as Panova. I grew up 2 blocks from Hercules. So, interestingly, when you live in a community that chemical plants is a major employer, you really don't grasp how much damage is being done. You just don't fathom that so much is actually occurring. The other part of it is that your classmates, the parents of your classmates, are employed at these toxic sites. They come home with it on their clothes, on their shoes, on their skin, and they transfer that to their loved ones. Oftentimes, unknowingly, but even if known, not dealt with because that's your lifeblood. You earn a decent living. Oftentimes, you are able to send your children off to college, and they may become first generation to graduate from college. So it's really not until a disaster happens that you kind of get a little tap on your shoulder that this is what you're living with. I heard a fellow activist make a comment once that poisoned in broad daylight, suffering in silence. And that really captures where I live and how it happens. Medical professionals cannot help you. Why not? They're not trained. It's not part of the protocols. So when you have asthma, when you have COPD, when you have cancer, it's all attributed to so many other factors other than the dirt that's in your backyard that your parents got from Hercules for free. The water that you bathe in, where the pollutants are just emptied into the rivers and waterways. Brunswick, by the way, sits on the Atlantic Ocean. So I'm in coastal Georgia. I think you know what a coastal area is like. And to awaken your neighbors to the realities of what has been happening for generations and generations is not the easiest responsibility to accomplish. But it is one that if you really want to help your neighbors, you have to, in my estimation, start doing the work to educate them about the fish that's on their dinner table, about the shrimp and grits that they love to eat. Because we don't get our shrimp from anywhere but where we live. Our fish comes from where we live. It is sustenance for us. So the forever chemicals that are in the community where I live, and when I say forever chemicals, I'm speaking about toxaphene, PFAS, mercury. They're very real. And the health of many of my neighbors is not good. Cancer, as a child, I used to wonder, why do so many people die of cancer? And for one, diet is always the contributing factor. You know, oftentimes by, you know, if you ask your physician, that is often what will be said. Even though, where is the correlation of a study to support that opinion? We do not have it. Recently, I've been working with an organization, Emory University, that has come into our neighborhood and tested blood of individuals. One of the partners in this effort is Coastal Community Health, wherein, and he is a doctor and a executive director of an organization, Coastal Community Health, wherein doctors, that is medical professionals, are now beginning to realize they need to ask more questions and try to become more aware of what has really polluted the paradise, I call it a polluted paradise. Because it is paradise, it's my home, it's beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful, but it's also very poisoned.
Up in now?
Yes.
All right, my approach is going to be a little different. I warned you that I'm a newcomer to this, and I want to thank you. I also, yes, the greatest education I've had has been working with Jazz and Ms. Anita and their family members and colleagues along the Georgia coast. I learned the hard way decades ago that, particularly as an academic, I at least had a tendency to think of things to do to neighborhoods, to solve them. And then I usually justified it by saying, I'm really intending to do something for neighborhoods. And so I would rewrite laws for neighborhoods. But it wasn't until I spent days every week in a neighborhood that I learned my approach was wrong in trying to either do things to a neighborhood or for a neighborhood. I needed to do things with the people who resided there. And so I've tried at this point in my life to flip my approach. So instead of drafting laws first, which is one of the things I do a lot of, I don't. I try to listen to the people and to get to know the people in the neighborhood. Now, my own style, for a variety of other reasons, is always to listen to the residents, but to listen to the residents oftentimes in their faith communities. In many neighborhoods where I work, across Georgia, across the South, it is the places of worship or faith communities that tell me the most about the priorities, the challenges, and the neighborhoods. It is by listening to them in their faith communities to tell me, they tell me, and I get to see and understand. It began that way in a microcosm of the flooding graveyard due to the rise in water tables. And one of the residents in one of these communities simply asked me, can we relocate that grave? Now that takes you down a very tortured path in the legal studies of who has the right to control the location of the grave. But the background was, they said, I am not leaving. These are my people here. And that led us down to a fascinating, intellectually fascinating set of questions there. But I want to shift a bit. I'm so excited because y'all are phenomenal scientists, data wonks, leaders. I'm none of that. I have a simple question that residents ask me that I need your help answering. Where is the public land? And who owns it? Now, think about your own neighborhood where you live. Whether it's in Pitt County, North Carolina, or in McIntosh in Georgia, or Jacksonville, Duval, or wherever. Where is the public land and who owns it? I would love it if you could figure out a way to answer that question for me. Now, I'll unpack it a little bit. I'll bracket the federal government entirely for the time being. So we're not dealing with DOD or transportation, anything. I'm also going to bracket all nonprofit-owned interests. Can you tell me, and by that I mean, can you map for me on a GIS data set all of the publicly owned land in your neighborhood? Can you show me what is state-owned in your neighborhood, your county? Now, I thought that would have been an easy question. And maybe in some of your states, there is an easy answer to that. I was told there was an easy answer to that in Georgia with the data set. We pulled the data set and I said, yes, it shows a lot of the state-owned lands, particularly through our Department of Natural Resources. But of course, DNR for us doesn't own all the state-owned land. It's vested in the state of Georgia, and if it carries the name DNR, that tells me it's in DNR control. But what about the State Department of Transportation? What about the State Department of Corrections? Is there a database that can map in your community all of the state-owned lands? If y'all's jurisdictions are anything like ours in Georgia, we have a tendency to create separate public authorities that own and control land, and those may or may not be in the state database. Sapelo Island is an example of a state-created heritage authority, which is great, but we can't map it in the state database. All right, so can you tell me what the state owns in Buncombe County, Asheville? In all the various forms of state ownership, can you identify that? And again, as a dirt lawyer, I want to know the right-of-way lines of the highways that the state owns and controls, because that's what tends to impact the neighborhood, the residents. I then take it down a step from the state ownership to the county ownership. What lands are owned by the county? And I mean, of course, here with all of its variations. The county school board, the county health department, all publicly owned land. Why can't we simply have it on a single database? And then municipal as well. And again, as a dirt lawyer, I'd push to take it further. Can we map the infrastructure and know whose infrastructure it is? Can we map the stormwater systems, the wastewater systems, so that all of us together can share that database and see it? Again, I'm bracketing the federal for the time being and NGOs for the time being. My plea on this particular point of where is the public land and who owns and controls it is because I think there's opportunity simply by having a shared database to see where property swaps can occur, where land can be conveyed from an abandoned school, a school board, to a public works department at the city, the county, the state level, where when you're dealing with new right-of-way needs, you can identify who's involved in this. So my hope, again, a naive outsider in this space, is it would make such a difference if we could periodically, for a given county, have all of the public land ownership identified and a quarterly meeting of all the folks that know that stuff, just to share the common database, in hopes that it becomes an opportunity to immediately turn to that database as you're doing either disaster response or disaster resiliency planning. Because I really want to save time for questions, let me give you 3 examples which I have been really helpful to me as I do this work. One is a study that has just been completed by something called the Lincoln Land Institute in Cambridge. Their study is Who Owns America? They pulled the most sophisticated databases that they could and allow that in certain instances to be available. And I was working on that with them 2 weeks ago, and I was just fascinated by what they were able to show. Now, they couldn't yet do the kinds of things that I really want to be able to do, which is to be able to show all the easements and restrictive covenants as a dirt lawyer, where I've got conservation easements or restrictions in FEMA buybacks and things like that. But it is getting there. So that's one source to put on your agenda, touching base with the Lincoln Land Institute for their Who Owns America database, and see how that corresponds to your own state, county, municipal database. The second example, I want to actually defer to our colleagues here from Miami-Dade. Who is from Miami-Dade? Yes. A report that Mayor Levine Cava, am I saying it right? Mayor Levine Cava issued 2 years ago, based upon 2 years of work. I think it was University of Miami data scientists, pulled out all of the property held by the county and the school board, and mapped it, and discovered that on many instances, the county would own a tract of land that the county had no use for, but it was still titled in the county, usually by tax foreclosure stuff. And the school board owned a contiguous piece of property, but it was not large enough to be developed for school purposes. It became an opportunity for them to collaborate together, to swap property interest and put it back into use. The title of the story is Public Land Stewardship in Miami-Dade. I can give you a full citation to it. I didn't bring a QR code. But it also has a chapter, a section of that report that talks about simply land exchange of public property among public entities for housing, for education, for open space. That is part of what I'm pleading that y'all think about, is simply creating a common database of all public interests in that. The third example is actually San Juan, Puerto Rico, a nonprofit that was created shortly after the hurricane called the Center for the Reconstruction of Habitat or Housing. They have spent the last 2 years doing a study of public land. And what they've discovered and focused on is the inventory of schools that have been shut down over the decade, primarily by population decline, but also by virtue of disasters. CRH, Luis Gallardo, has focused on land exchanges between the municipality and the state, Department of Education or equivalent there, where the abandoned schools can be swapped to be used for community centers. But that was not at all even possible before Luis and his team had done an extensive survey of every parcel of land due to the absence of comprehensive data sets anyway. So the opportunity to engage in what I refer to as public land stewardship, simply by having a common data set, is huge. The final point is that Luis Gallardo in Puerto Rico, folks in Miami-Dade, always do this data, but then turn to the community. We've got all these different parcels that are owned. What are the goals of the community? Is it open space? Is it affordable housing? Is it education? As you then let the residents lead the charge to push for land exchanges that acknowledge climate resiliency. Now, my dream, of course, is that as y'all help us together develop this common data set of public lands, that we can make it pretty sophisticated. I have gotten in the bad habit, as one of our speakers this morning referred to, of asking county leadership to tell me where the on-site wastewater systems, what we call septic, are. And my state has terrible records on what septic permits were ever issued or the last time they were inspected. In the county in which you live, do you know where all the septic systems are? They're the first ones to fail as water tables rise. Okay, on that micro point, the folks at Wetlands Watch in Norfolk, in the Hampton Roads area, are doing the most creative things, I think, of anticipating the collapse of septic systems and modifying the requirements for permits in the future. If we had together this public land ownership, I would then be able to have greater conversations with TNC, TCF, World Wildlife, TPL, on the land that's available for conservation, protection, conservation easements there. Right now, unfortunately, it's tough for any of them unless they have a particular property already identified. They do the comprehensive title exam to figure out, oh, this is owned by the county. Oh, next door it's owned by the state. Yes, and we got DOT running right through it as we're seeking to put it into conservation. So that's a plea I make as an outsider, but always with a predicate of we got to be engaging with the folks who are on the ground. If not, if we're not listening to them and learning from them, then we're actually going to be part of the problem in doing that.
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Frank. I think, when we first met, I was working at this law center, and he was retiring from Emory University, and I had heard so much about him. But what stood out to me was this person that had all this legal knowledge, expertise, background, everything, was that he said, well, I want to learn from you. When we went to spaces working together, it was about listening to what people wanted and then responding to that in a way that supports them. So before we get to a Q&A, what I wanted to ask Ms. Anita briefly, because she did bring up a study. So when we're talking about, entities and institutions partnering with community-based organizations, just like, Frank was talking about mapping out and knowing, all the public land and the partnerships and the institutions, are they connected to the communities and the people? Because when these disasters happen, we know that sometimes there are places that people can't go back to. They may be completely wiped out. Are we preparing for that? And I don't mean preparing for that from, whether it's an academic sense or a research sense or a governmental sense, but in a community sense where everyone is a part of that equation. Because if they're not, you're going to have the missing pieces, and the pieces are going to be the people and the communities. And you need them. We all need each other for this to work. So, Ms. Anita, and you mentioned coastal community health. So this Emory study was a study regarding toxins from contamination in community members in their bodies. But it was something that was driven by the community members. The community members wanted to do a health fair and a health study, and then they reached out and wanted to further do this study. So 100 residents from Brunswick had their blood tested. Can you just talk a little bit about what made that partnership work with that institution?
First of all, the community health fair was well attended. And when I said it was well attended, a number of people came out because they wanted to know what was in their blood. And this was the first time for so many individuals to even have an opportunity to learn that there may be something in your blood, all right? So getting folks, making the information public, and what I mean public is by just reaching out, making sure your neighbors knew and you encourage them to get there. One of the things that our organization, our neighborhood organization did was to call folk, have you gone to get your blood tested? And it's amazing when you find out, if you just pick up a phone and call somebody else, or knock on their door, that they have not gotten their blood tested, but then they do go and get their blood tested, and that piques their interest tremendously. And just by communicating with them, that is by having the researchers conduct community meetings and to be very forthcoming about the results and what is needed from the members in the community. And you hear the term stakeholders. Well, a lot of times it's just words, because you really don't want to hear what folks have to say. But what the Emory researchers learned, because they took the time to listen, was that people had been wanting to know for a long time what was going on and try to get answers as to why so many people that they loved and cared for died of cancer. So I know there's a cancer alley in the Delta area. Well, there's also a cancer alley in the coastal Georgia area as well. Folks may not talk about it, but it is very real. Working with community means you just, first of all, don't come in scientific, make it plain. A lot of times you forget that everyone is not a scientist, has no interest in being a scientist. So when you come, you have to come in a manner of speaking at a third grade level. And I know that may be hard, but it's what is needed, because you want the community to appreciate you, to trust you. And that's been a big thing in my area, is trusting individuals who come in. You know, they come in, they have their cape on and they're ready to save you. They're not talking to you, and they're definitely not listening to you, so how are they going to save you? But the success so far with the Emory project is because there are a number of us who meet every other week with the researchers, and one of the components is to definitely engage the community and keep the community engaged. Another thing is, for those blood samples, it wasn't much, but everyone who participated in that initial study, they received a gift card. And like I said, it wasn't much, but at least they didn't come in and say, we want your blood, and go out the door. And people use those gift cards to put gas in the car or to get food on the table, which meant something. The Emory researchers have conducted several neighborhood meetings of the community so people can come out and ask questions. Because we do have a lot of questions, because they're concerned about their children who are grown by now, and their grandchildren, and the deleterious effects of living where you live and being consumed by all of this. And yes, you have to be careful so there's not information overload, but it's a fine line that you kind of dance in terms of sharing, demonstrating that you are concerned and not just a statistic or another number has been very helpful. Another thing I want to just segue to, just being here today, I learned about some things that are happening, okay, that I did not know and I should have known. Because when you're doing work, or say you're doing work about a community, then all the communities, not just one tiny portion of the community, but all aspects of the community should know about it. And I implore you that if you come into a county, a city, find out what the neighborhood organizations are. Those neighborhood organizations are not, it's not necessarily a nonprofit. We have a lot of nonprofits in our community, but they're not in the community. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
No, thank you, Ms. Anita. And I'll just say a couple things, because I know we want to have time for Q&A. The other thing that these researchers did was they really listened to the community. Before they even published the paper, the residents asked if they could see what they were writing, and they allowed that. They said that's not something that they usually do. And the residents gave them some feedback. You know, the other thing that they did was they said, well, how can we access this information? Because we all know when you're doing research and you're writing papers, sometimes you can't access that information, or it's written in a way that is not more community-centered. And so they did things that weren't usually done. When they work collaboratively with the community to further apply for another grant, they made sure to include them at the table from the very beginning. They had a portion of that grant that was dedicated to community, compensation, advisory boards, all of those things. There's one article from the Rollins School of Public Health called "The Burden of Brunswick" that talks about, that does talk about this study, and all of this, ties into land. It ties right into land. We're talking about a community too that has, abandoned and vacant buildings and properties because these are communities that have been disinvested, right? Some communities got investment, others didn't. So we know the history of all of this. So everything is tied together. So it is incumbent that we can bring all of these things into one space, in a sense, and work together collaboratively. So if you're really interested in resilience, is what Ms. Collins just said, and meaning, if you're really interested in that hard work, because think about it, people can do this work and they can get by and they can get awards and accolades and all those other things, and they don't have to go and talk to the neighborhood or deal with this individual or that individual, or they can deal with just one or two stakeholders and not everyone else. But is that truly the work that you want to do if you want it to be truly, truly impactful? And those are the things that I think about. And the last point is, Frank and I, we've done some work with the local land bank that's there in Brunswick. And, one of the main things that we say to them, and even talking about even identifying properties, is, are they going to the community? Are they talking to the community about the properties that are right there next to them that they already have plans for redevelopment? Because they're the key. They can tell you things that you may not even know, because let's face it, some of these counties and cities, the databases aren't accurate sometimes. So we need one another. Did you want to add anything? And then we'll do question.
The point that Jazz and I have been asked so often recently, because we do spend a lot of time with what is called loosely air property, is the inability of owners of fractured title, by virtue of it being air property, to access FEMA relief, state disaster assistance, local disaster assistance. And so I implore you, another plea is that as you design your disaster response or disaster resilience, you acknowledge that our culture, American culture, has created a priority on being able to prove insurable and marketable title in some way in order to get disaster relief. We were able to deal with that in Louisiana post-Katrina by reforming some regs that FEMA was issuing. But still, it's a question that arises in every disaster of the ability to provide assistance to a homeowner. What are your preconditions with respect to proof of ownership? And obviously collateral questions of mortgagees claiming the proceeds on that. So bear that in mind, that as you're dealing with residential, more or less owner occupied, whether it's on coastal Georgia, middle Georgia, in Buncombe County in the mountains, how are you dealing with that? And as you deal with that, teach the rest of us in other states of how you're making the aid available without imposing impossible burdens on proof of title. And again, we can subdivide it into mobile homes, manufactured housing, and other things.
Thank you. We have time, a few minutes for some questions. Okay, so go till 12:15 and people can ask.
10 minutes.
Okay. Questions? Yes. Back here. Okay.
Okay, thanks. My question is for Anita. with the study, the blood study that you did, what was the actual funding source for that? And then what did the individuals do with their results? Like, what next? So, like, it just made me kind of think, okay, now you have this result, now what?
Okay, I want to make certain that I heard your question. The reaction to the results, that was a part of the question, and what was the other part? Funding source? I can't answer. Well, the funding came from a small, came through Emory University, and it was a small, that's why it was only 100 people that were selected initially. And I cannot tell you what grant that would have come from. I don't remember, okay? When people found out about it, okay, so you had PFAS, and you had, what's the T that I keep forgetting?
Toxaphene.
Toxaphene. I don't know why I keep forgetting it, you know? Probably because in my mind, I just think forever chemicals, okay? And forever is that's a harsh word in that respect. What do we do? Yeah. Well, your medical professionals can't help you because they don't know. So that's why I was saying that that is still something that is still out there, okay? And many folks are just resigned that that's what it is. So therefore, we need more research, and we need more medical professionals to really understand that their training and diagnoses needs to, improvements needs to be made. So therefore, the Emory Research wants to do a broader study with more individuals in hopes that this can ignite something that we can get some long-term health care relief.
Yeah, and so the community and Emory have collaboratively with our neighborhood organizations applied for additional funding to expand the study to neighboring counties and neighboring communities, basically, to further the study. And then at some point in time, obviously, Emory is an institution, but it empowers the individuals to make decisions about what those next steps may look like for them. So, over here.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question. So,
Thank you both for your presentations. This is in regard to land. So I'm Hillary Lohman. I'm with the Department of Planning and Natural Resources in the Virgin Islands. We only have one tier of government, and we have that spatial layer, which is like, I have never been able to get up at a regional meeting, am I right, the Virgin Islands, and be like, we have the thing that you guys don't. And I wanted to share for us, it's at our Lieutenant Governor's office. It is simply, it's where there's a website called MapGeo, mapgeo.com, and that's where you can just see, it is not up to, there are things about the resolution of the boundaries that definitely needs furthering anytime you're doing any business related to it, but that is a website where you can see land ownership at the parcel level. And there's two layers. One is federal government, which doesn't necessarily go further parcel by parcel, and the other is government of the Virgin Islands, which doesn't go, like, again, it could be a school that gets that. It could be a empty parcel of land that gets the government of the Virgin Islands. So that's housed at our Lieutenant Governor's office. And I wanted to say also the Comprehensive Land and Water Use Plan, which I didn't even put the website up, planusvi.com. You can find the Comprehensive Land and Water Use Plan and the implementation matrix, which is what's next. One of the major things that not only is a priority in the implementation matrix, and one of the things that our department is tackling next is an inventory of that layer to say what are these assets, what are the benefits of what opportunities lie in their locations for different situations that might not have been thought of before, and also what risks do they face that maybe make them less beneficial than we might think to certain hazards. So overlaying floodplains, and tsunami zones with, every year every year when you decide where the hurricane risk zones are. And another thing I wanted to say in small spaces, the FEMA presentation from Puerto Rico was exceptional. We have all of the same problems, except I don't think we got out of it with that funding forward thing, so I'll be following up on that. Another thing I wanted to share for small areas, we can't get a lot of, there's a project in Charlotte, O'Malley, there's a school and a hospital that are federally funded for us to get done, but the space is so small that you cannot demolish the laydown. There's not a laydown construction area for both of those projects to happen at once. But what we did was we went to that layer. That was the only layer we had to go to and say, what are the different government layers from schools to like poor, kind of like things in poor condition to things in good condition. So I just wanted to point out that like those are a few examples of how the USVI does use the layer that was described, and I think it's a great idea. And also our Parks and Protected Areas Division went right there and said what parcels are already in the government that might serve as like pocket parks or just other things that are just like preliminarily right on deck because we already own it when that was a government approach. So thank you.
And do we have any more questions? Yeah, 2 minutes. If anybody has another question. Yes.
Thanks. One of the discussions I've had when I've been to Brunswick and folks, we've talked about things they need, and we've often talked about the research aspects that they need. A lot of times they've mentioned just grant coordinators, just people to find money. Right. Can you speak to the need for that kind of aspect for the community members? Because I've heard it time and time again that the research that comes from outside is nice, but what they're looking for is like grant coordinators to find economic opportunities that can, they're like grant coordinators who get paid for them to work in the community that helps bring money into the community. But finding those positions or writing those grant coordinators into other grants can be difficult.
Well, I'll speak first and then let Ms. Anita speak. I'll say this. Sometimes in spaces, you have, not sometimes, but they're there. You have these tiers. So you have some nonprofits that have, incredible capacity, right? And then you have some that just have zero or none. They don't have a lot. So they can't afford to have someone, helping them to, look for grants or have a grant coordinator. Wouldn't it be great if, those that had the resources were thinking in partnerships in those ways, right? Working in collaboration with neighborhood planning assemblies and things of that nature, instead of most of the time they go get the grant and then they come to them, and half the time they're not in that budget, or they might have a little bit for them, right? And the thing about it is sometimes there's information that they could have learned from the community that might have even made it even a stronger project. So that's a significant need that you stated. I don't know what you want to add to that, Ms. Anita.
As I understand it, our city government does not have a grant person. Therefore, they contract with someone for grants, but it's not like having a designated person right there where that's their responsibility to get grants from local governments for a variety of needs. And the other aspect, Jazz has already answered. There are so many small nonprofits that just don't have the capacity to have a designated person to search for grants and then develop the grant. And then the other part with developing grants is sometimes the paperwork is so burdensome that why bother for $5,000? So that's a whole process that we could talk for a while about. And I know that because I've heard the frustration from these smaller nonprofits that want to do something, and they'll end up maybe getting 2,000, 5,000, maybe 10,000. But that's not going to sustain them for long. And then they can't hire anybody, retain anybody to be a grant writer, okay? Because they can't afford it. So anyway, the whole grant process can be very great, but also it can cut your throat.
Thank you for that question. And I know our time is up. No, thank you very much for having all of us.